Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our webinar series that occurs here on our Facebook page every Friday at noon. Today we have with us Jon Kaplan. He has been the Bicycle and Pedestrian Program Manager at VTrans since 2009 and has worked in the program since 2000. Jon is involved with program funding and development, policy, technical assistance, safety education, and the promotion of bicycling and walking. He has been involved with bicycle and pedestrian planning and design since 1993. Today, Jon is going to be talking about how we can make changes to bike and pedestrian safety at a low cost. So I'm going to introduce Jon now. Hi, Jon. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I'm very looking forward to what you're going to present, so I'm going to pass it off to you now.
All right. Great. So hopefully folks are seeing my slides. So this is a presentation that I've actually been doing for a while with mostly with municipalities and also through the regional planning commissions, other venues like Vermont Local Roads, which is an organization that works with municipalities on technical assistance. But also kind of put a little bit of a spin on it in terms of some of the kind of changes to the road network that are being looked at and implemented by communities in response to COVID-19. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the things that the pandemic has sort of resulted in is that I think it's in kind of the trying to look at silver linings, kind of an opportunity for communities to look at streets and how they're being used and maybe make some changes so that they work better for bicycling and walking. And some of that is that with a lot of people working at home, there is generally less traffic on the streets. Then you've got people who want to be getting outside and moving. That I've heard anecdotally, and I know that there are people doing counts. There's just a lot more people who are walking and biking these days than in the past. And so one thing that's resulted in is, especially in busier areas like Burlington, for example, that some of the existing facilities like the Burlington Bike Path, or maybe even a sidewalk, don't really provide enough space for the people that are using those facilities and, to allow them to be there and then also maintain the, social distancing that we're being asked to do to help, prevent the spread of COVID. So, and then there's the other sort of economic development aspect of restaurants in particular who've been pretty hard hit, needing to or working on reopening, but not having all the availability of their indoor seats. And so there's a lot of effort to look at like reusing or repurposing parking spaces as extra seating for those businesses. Next. So in response to that, two state agencies, so our agency and the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, worked on an interim set of guidelines for communities to who want to look at using, say, a parking space for some other purpose. So those guidelines are out there currently, and this sort of happened in the context of our agency was already working on some guidelines for what we're calling demonstration projects or short-term projects. And anyway, the interim guidelines are a little bit less detailed, I would say. There's a couple of communities in Vermont who had already been working on this for several years. Burlington and Montpelier both have some versions of pop-up project guidance. And so even with all of this, there's a number of communities around the state that are doing projects like this. This is the other picture in this slide is just from a news story about Brattleboro repurposing some parking spaces for, I think, both public space and for restaurants. So there's some real benefits of these demonstration or pop-up projects. One of the things is that one of the really important things is that it offers the community a chance to try out a design before doing a lot of investment and making it permanent. Kind of allows a chance to like see how something is working and maybe modify the design before making it into a more permanent project. Things can get implemented pretty quickly, so that's another benefit. A lot of times they're seasonal, especially like the restaurant seating, because we're not going to have people sitting outside in the middle of the winter, of course. They're low cost because of the materials that are used, so much less than like a permanent installation, especially when you're talking about things like concrete for sidewalks and things like that. And then it's an opportunity to gather some data, like if a community puts in a temporary bike lane, they can do some counts and see how the addition of that facility impacts behavior. And then, part of that data gathering is getting some input from the public. And again, that's a good way to see what might need to be modified with the design to make it work better. So this is a picture from a project. I actually just went and visited this project under construction in Rutland. This is on Center Street in Rutland, which is the street right off their downtown that goes by the Paramount Theater. And they're doing kind of a whole reimagining of that street to narrow the travel lanes, provide some restaurant seating for, I think, 3 or 4 restaurants, and to kind of calm traffic and make the crossings safer. They're adding a mid-block crossing as part of this project. There's some street art that's going in. So I actually just saw some new photos from some work they did yesterday, and it's even in like the 2 days since I've been down there, they've made great strides. And this is all supposed to be up and running by the 4th of July. So there's definitely a lot of momentum on this in this area of kind of pop-up or short-term projects around the state, which is great to see. Next. So there's a couple of different places where communities can get assistance. So Local Motion, which is the statewide bicycle and pedestrian advocacy organization, they are, well, I'm kind of working together with them, but we're both available to provide technical assistance. And I know that Brianna is going to put up links to various things that I'm talking about in this presentation. So you'll have that available afterwards. Next. Okay. Okay, so now just to get into some of the details, and a lot of these things are ideas that I've been promoting for a while, which are bike and pedestrian facilities sometimes can be kind of daunting from at a municipal level because they can be an expensive project. But I think what often gets overlooked is some of the easier, low cost things that communities can do to make their existing roads work better for biking and walking. So one really simple thing, which our agency has been doing for a while now, is just to narrow the travel lanes. So a 12-foot travel lane was pretty typical for a long time. And there's actually been some study done that like a 10 or 11-foot lane is actually the safest width on roads that are posted at 40 miles an hour or less. So when a road gets repaved or the markings have worn off and they need to be redone, especially that white edge line, just moving that in a foot or so just provides some extra space on the shoulder for biking or walking. And I would say the cost of this type of improvement is essentially zero because you would be marking that edge line anyway. So just changing its location, there's really no cost to doing that. And then, if you already have shoulders that are 4 or 5 feet wide, um, and it's in a more busy area where you want to sort of designate the space for bicycling, marking those shoulders as bike lanes. That's a pretty relatively inexpensive improvement, and it can really make improve the safety of bicyclists by kind of designating that space. So in addition to just um, marking the shoulders, making them a little bit wider, potentially marking them as bike lanes, maintenance is really important. um, so if you have a nice wide paved shoulder, but then you either have brush that overhangs it or a bunch of gravel and glass that's accumulated there, you kind of lost that facility, and bicyclists end up having to go out into the travel lane. So maintaining shoulders is really important. So just having good visible signs at crosswalks. This is another important feature. And uh, so there's a fluorescent yellow-green background, which is shown on these school signs. That's a requirement for that type of sign, but it can be used for bicycle and other bicycle and pedestrian signs. So our agency uses the fluorescent yellow-green as a standard for all of our pedestrian signs. I've seen a lot of signs in my traveling around the state that are just faded, not necessarily properly located, and so just getting the right signs or newer signs put up with this fluorescent yellow green background, and that's really minimal added cost. The cost of the sign doesn't change because of the color. So another thing that you can do is if you have a location where there's some, data that says that motorists maybe aren't um, paying attention to the signs, you can add a sort of it's like a plastic insert that goes on the sign post, and it's the same color as whatever the sign color is. So those are about $25 per sign. And it's a good way to enhance the visibility. They really do stand out because not all signs have these extra plastic strips on them. And this is another sort of maintenance issue. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but there is a crosswalk sign where the blue circle is behind the tree, and uh, so you know, just looking or kind of evaluating the signs and seeing where there is some maintenance needed to trim tree branches back or brush that might be obscuring the visibility of the sign. Because it's great to put up the sign, but if the motorists can't see them, then they're not really doing their job. So just providing crosswalks and keeping them up to remarked every year. That's a really important pedestrian safety feature. The crosswalk in this picture is the block pattern, that's our state standard that VTrans uses on the state system. And that is one of the more visible crosswalk patterns. There's several different crosswalk patterns that the MUTCD allows. The MUTCD is the sort of national manual that VTrans and towns are supposed to follow, that spells out like different signs and pavement markings. So, but the block pattern is very visible. One of the reasons we switched to it is that cars can travel in, between the markings a little bit more, so they tend to wear a little bit longer. So having good visible crosswalks is important. And then sort of parking related to crosswalks. So there is a state law about not allowing parking within 20 feet of crosswalks at intersections. We use that 20-foot dimension or offset at all of our crosswalks on the state system. So there actually is someone right behind that white van who's trying to cross. There is a crosswalk there. I think this is actually the same crosswalk where the sign was obscured by the tree, so kind of a lot of things going on here. And you can see, because the parking is right up against the crosswalk, the problem with that is that it makes it really hard for drivers to see pedestrians who are waiting. Plus, it makes it hard for the pedestrian to be able to look and see if there's a gap in traffic. So these in-street signs, these are another, relatively low-cost feature that can be added to a crosswalk just to help, reinforce that motorists are supposed to be yielding to pedestrians at a crosswalk. We do have a process at VTrans if a town wants to install one of these on a crosswalk on the state system, but towns can do it on their own, on their roads. Of course, they have jurisdiction over their own roads. So pedestrian refuge islands, this is another feature that kind of a big bang for the buck, I would say, especially if you have a multi-lane crossing or like a center lane that's a turn lane. Having this refuge island where pedestrians can kind of cross the road in two stages. These are a feature that Federal Highway is actually encouraging as what they call a proven safety countermeasure. And you can see in the last bullet there, these can reduce the crashes by almost 50%. So, and they don't have to cost a lot of money or be, very extravagant. It can be a real benefit. So if you think back to that other picture with the van and the pedestrian behind the van, putting a so putting a bulb out at that location where you have on-street parking, that kind of gives you the option to put in a bulb out. And what those do is it kind of gets pedestrians out past the edge of the parked cars where they can be visible and where they can see traffic a lot better. And these actually, this one in this picture is in Northfield, and they did a demonstration project probably, I don't know, 15 years ago, before sort of pop-up projects was a thing. But they put some cones out there to kind of demonstrate how the bulb outs would function, and they moved the cones around to make sure trucks could still get around the corner. And then eventually they made these bulb outs permanent. So that's made a real difference at this crossing, which used to be really long. So this is these rectangular flashing beacons. This has become kind of a popular enhancement to existing crossings where there's some either history of people not yielding or other factors like who is using the crosswalk, like if it's a lot of school children or elderly population that where there's kind of a more of a need to make sure that vehicles are aware that there's a crossing here. So these are push button activated. They don't stop traffic necessarily. It's not like a red light, but they are very visible and help to enhance the safety at an existing crosswalk. So we're kind of going up in cost as I've been going through these different features. And we're trying to use these flashing beacons strategically around the state so they don't get overused. But certainly there's some locations where they're warranted and communities are interested in using them. So just providing sidewalks in the first place is a big safety enhancement. And if you see something like a worn path in the grass, that's a pretty clear indicator that pedestrians are already wanting to walk there, even if there's no facility. So putting in sidewalks is a good way to enhance the pedestrian environment. And then just another kind of maintenance issue. So once you do put in sidewalks, then they do have to be maintained in the winter, especially if it's a sidewalk that's serving um, like a school or a downtown area that is going to have business year round. So that winter maintenance aspect is very important. And then bike parking. This is something that I think communities are starting to look at a little bit more as part of their development review standards. But just providing some bike parking, especially at like public buildings like libraries or in front of retail businesses, so people have a place to secure their bike if they've gotten there that way. And then if it's longer term parking, like at a apartment complex or an employer, often that's covered, or sometimes it might even be like part of a parking garage, so it's covered and more secure that way. So I just did a presentation earlier this week with one of the regional planning commissions where we were talking about how to require developers to provide some of this infrastructure. And towns definitely have it within their sort of power and local development review process to do this. I think it's somewhat, making sure they're aware of the fact that they could do that. And, so that a lot of that has to do with like connections from where the development is out to the road network, and making sure that there's a way for people to walk into that, whatever that development is. And so a lot of this is all in the sort of general context of complete streets. And there's some great resources. The Department of Health several years ago developed this complete streets guide, and this is one of the links that we put up. So that's there as a great resource. Lots of good, diagrams and photos of different facilities. And then this federal highway publication that came out, I don't know, 2 years ago maybe, which is focused on small towns and rural areas, is really perfect for Vermont. And again, it has great. It does have the technical information, but it's kind of boiled down into a very concise way and with good illustrations and lots of like case studies. So I definitely advise towns who are interested in biking and walking facilities to take a look at this, especially for like our small towns. All right, so that was kind of a whirlwind of different ideas, and I think a lot of those things could be used as part of a like pop-up or demonstration project. And yeah, I guess if there's any questions, we can try and tackle those.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that presentation. And we have one question right now. I have a few questions, and I'm sure a couple people will chime in as well. But our first question is from Kara Benson, and she says, rapid flashing beacons seem overused, ineffective, and expensive when compared to more community-driven solutions that involve paint bollards, planters, and other strategies that fundamentally slow down drivers. She's wondering what your view is on directing that money to local groups to solve the problems through creative solutions that can be improved incrementally.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We've been trying to, like I said before, use those flashing beacons strategically, and actually we're just starting or going to be starting a research project that UVM is doing for us, starting this fall, to look at the effectiveness of those flashing beacons around the state compared to just a regular marked crosswalk. There's some national data, but not a lot in a state like Vermont. So That will be interesting to see. Um, and definitely what I always advise communities is, start with the lower cost. Don't jump right to the flashing beacon, which is what some of them tend to do, but start with the lower cost improvements. If there's no crosswalk there now, put the crosswalk in first with the proper signs and then see how it's working. And then you can kind of incrementally add to it, to see if that changes drivers' behaviors and whether it can be safe or not.
Definitely. And will that data be on VTrans website?
Yes, I think the study that UVM's doing, or the research UVM's doing, is going to take a little over a year. So it won't be they're just starting it this fall. So it'll probably be available like end of 21.
Okay. So the next question is from Jack Hansen. And he asks, why is it that so many complete streets don't have dedicated bicycle infrastructure?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So, you know, one thing about the term complete streets that I think has been kind of problematic is that um, there's no like one particular thing that is a quote unquote complete street. It is all kind of context driven. Um, I would agree that I guess as far as different, bike infrastructure, I think the Cadillac is kind of something that has physical separation between where bikes are and where cars are, whether that's a separated bike lane. Like I know Burlington has done some or installed some of those where there's like a painted area that also has some vertical element between where cars are and where the bikes are. Um, and that is what is going to make people who are kind of on the fence about biking feel more comfortable. Um, but you also have to, sometimes that involves like a tough decision about um, whether you have to remove some on-street parking or get rid of a travel lane. And those are challenging trade-offs that like public works folks have to get into. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but
The next question is from Jacob Weinstein, who's an intern at STVT. And when having discussions regarding complete streets, he's often heard a response along the lines of streets in New England, Burlington especially, are too narrow. Um, what's your view on that?
well, I kind of just addressed that. I think that is a challenge. You know, it's pretty rare, I would say, although we do have some cases where we have like so much width that it's hard to figure out how to reallocate it, or we have a lot of flexibility. So then you do get into those kind of trade-off questions of, on-street parking potentially, or, if you have like a 4-lane road, can it work as a 2-lane road, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think we do have some narrow right of ways where it's tough to fit everything in. And sometimes like, just use like downtown Barrie as an example. There's really no bike infrastructure there. There's fairly wide sidewalks. There's on-street parking on both sides, but the traffic moves through there so slowly that, I think a lot of bicyclists could function just out in the roadway pretty safely.
Definitely. The next question is from Dave Cohen, and he's wondering if you have any thoughts about areas near schools and parks where we have more parents in Vermont are taking their children by cargo bike. As the founder of Ebike and having a sense of the pulse on what is happening around new bike tech and design, I see in the next 2 years a massive growth in e-bikes and e-cargo bikes. How can we get ready for this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I just, anecdotally, I would definitely say I've seen a lot more e-bikes in the last couple of years. And I think that does have the potential for a lot of growth. And, I think there's some good momentum in a lot of Vermont communities who are, working to make things more bike friendly. VTrans has been trying to do that, like with our paving projects, where we add width to the paved shoulders. So I think we're certainly aware of that, and trying to look at making improvements whenever we have a project out there.
Definitely. And I think this is the last question, but how can individuals advocate for improvements like these?
Well, a lot of it is, I think a lot of the bicycling infrastructure really does happen at the local level. So, getting involved with your local government, whether it's through, if there's some kind of a bike or pedestrian committee, or just, finding out who's on the select board and starting to talk to them about, how they're investing in different things like sidewalks and, bike infrastructure potentially. And then that other avenue I mentioned, like the development review, I think that's kind of a missed opportunity a lot of the time, to have that infrastructure get built as part of, when new development comes in.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing your data with us and answering our questions.
Sure. Well, appreciate it.
So I'm going to just switch over and announce our speaker for next week. But if anyone has other questions for Jon, if you want, this is probably the last time that you could post in the comment section and he'll be able to answer it. But thank you for being here. And I'm going to switch over and announce our new speaker for next week.
Sure. Thanks again.
So next week, I'm just going to share my screen 1 second. So I just want to make people aware of our website that shows what speakers are coming up. And then also this website also gives you access to any of the past talks that we've done, as well as captions. And I will post the link in the comment section. But next week, we're going to have with us Becca White, and she is a Vermont state legislator on the House Transportation Committee. And she's going to talk about the future of transportation. So tune in next Friday at 12 here on our Facebook page to hear Becca talk about the future of transportation.